Horror Stories from AI.
It started with a dare. Of course it did. No one in their right mind would voluntarily step foot into the old Myers factory after dark, but Jake said it would be epic. He even brought his phone to record, convinced he'd catch some kind of ghost footage to upload online. I didn't care about ghosts. Never believed in them, anyway. What scared me more was the thought of getting caught trespassing. The place was locked up for a reason, but Jake had a way of making you feel like a loser if you didn't go along with his dumb ideas. So there we were, me and Jake, climbing through a hole in the chain-link fence that surrounded the property. The factory loomed in the moonlight, a skeleton of rusted steel and shattered glass. The air smelled like mildew and rot. Every step we took on the cracked pavement seemed loud enough to wake the dead. "Don't wimp out on me now, Sarah," Jake whispered as we reached the front entrance. The massive double doors were chained shut, but Jake had already scoped out a broken window around the side. Typical Jake. I rolled my eyes but followed him anyway. He hoisted himself through first, then reached back to help me. Once inside, the darkness swallowed us. Jake switched on his flashlight, and the thin beam cut through the gloom, revealing long-forgotten machinery and graffiti-covered walls. The place felt wrong, like it wasn't just abandoned, but forgotten by time itself. "Let's check out the basement," Jake said, grinning. "That's where all the spooky stuff happens, right?" I hesitated. Why the basement? Because that's where they say the workers saw weird lights before the factory shut down, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "That's just a stupid rumor," I muttered, but Jake was already heading toward a staircase at the back of the room. The steps creaked under our weight as we descended, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. When we reached the basement, the flashlight's beam flickered. Jake smacked it, muttering about cheap batteries. Then we saw it, a faint, bluish glow seeping through a crack in the concrete floor. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Jake crouched down, inspecting the crack. "Looks like some kind of light," he said. "Probably just an electrical thing." "The factory's been shut down for decades," I pointed out. "There's no power here." Jake ignored me, pulling a rusted crowbar from his backpack. He wedged it into the crack and began prying at the concrete. "Help me out," he said, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. "Are you crazy? What if it's dangerous?" "It'll be fine," he said with that cocky grin of his. "Come on, Sarah. Don't be such a chicken." Against my better judgment, I grabbed the other end of the crowbar. Together, we managed to loosen a slab of concrete, revealing a swirling, shimmering portal beneath. The light pulsed and hummed, and I swear I could hear whispers coming from it, faint but insistent. "Holy crap," Jake breathed. "This is it. This is the kind of thing that gets you famous." He pulled out his phone and started recording, his voice shaking with excitement. But I couldn't move. The whispers were growing louder, almost like they were calling my name. I felt a pull, like the portal was reaching out to me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. "Let's go," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't right, Jake. We shouldn't be here." "Are you kidding? We have to check it out." He stood, pocketing his phone. Before I could stop him, he reached toward the portal. The moment his fingers brushed the swirling light, The basement seemed to explode with sound and color. The whispers became screams, and the air felt like it was being sucked out of the room. I tried to pull Jake back, but he was gone, sucked into the portal like a rag doll in a hurricane. And then it was quiet. Too quiet. The portal still glowed, but now it seemed darker, more menacing. I stared at it, shaking, torn between running and diving in after him. My heart told me to go, to save him if I could. But my brain told me that nothing good could come from following him. I stepped closer, the whispers now a chorus of voices, pleading, promising. I didn't want to believe them, but something about the portal felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting. Taking a deep breath, I reached out. The moment my hand touched the light, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was somewhere else. The sky was a sickly green, and the ground beneath me pulsed like flesh. Strange, towering creatures moved in the distance, their forms shifting and writhing in ways that made my head ache. And then I saw Jake. He was standing a few feet away, staring at something I couldn't see. Jake. I called, running to him. But when he turned to face me, his eyes were empty, his face slack. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Only a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to him. That's when I realized the portal hadn't just taken us somewhere else. It had changed us. And there was no going back.
They always told us to stay away from the cliffs at night. The fog hides things you don't want to find. Old Mrs. Lark would mutter, rocking on her porch. Most of us thought it was just a creepy bedtime story to keep kids from wandering too close to the edge. But the thing about warnings is that they only make some of us more curious. I've been having dreams, weird ones. Dreams of a glowing archway, its edges carved with symbols that twisted and moved when I tried to focus on them. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the hum of some unearthly sound still ringing in my ears. And each time, the dream ended with me standing on the cliffs, staring into the fog as a voice I couldn't quite hear whispered my name. Tonight, the moon was full, and the fog was heavier than ever. The kind of fog that seemed alive, curling around my ankles like icy fingers. I don't know what possessed me to go out there. Maybe it was the dreams, or maybe it was the way the fog seemed to call to me as I stared at it from my bedroom window. Either way, I found myself walking through the damp grass, a flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. The cliffs were eerily quiet, except for the soft crash of waves far below. The flashlight beam barely cut through the mist, but it was enough to spot the jagged rocks at the edge. And then I saw it, the archway. It was just like in my dreams, half hidden by moss and vines, its surface glowing faintly with that same strange light. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't hear the hum, not exactly, but I could feel it, a vibration in my chest, like a low, pulsing heartbeat. I stepped closer. The symbols on the archway shifted and swirled, and for a moment, I thought I saw my own reflection in the glow, but it wasn't me. Not exactly. The figure in the light looked like me, but its eyes were wrong. Too dark, too empty. This is insane, I muttered to myself, taking a shaky step back. But then the light intensified, and the fog seemed to close in around me. The whispers started, faint and far away at first, but growing louder with every passing second. They weren't just calling my name now, they were pleading, begging me to come closer. Before I knew what I was doing, I reached out and touched the archway. The light rippled beneath my fingers, warm and cold all at once. And then the world shifted. I stumbled forward into somewhere else. The air here was thick, like breathing through water, and the sky was an unnatural shade of green. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy, pulsing faintly with each step. Strange, jagged spires rose in the distance, their surfaces glistening like wet stone. I turned to look back at the portal. It was still there, but dimmer now, like it was fading. Panic surged in my chest. I'd only just arrived, but the thought of being trapped here forever made my blood run cold. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky and small. It echoed strangely, as if the air itself was bending the sound. And then I saw it, a figure standing far off in the distance. At first, I thought it was another person, maybe someone who could help. But as it moved closer, I realized it wasn't human. Its body was tall and thin, too thin, with joints that bent the wrong way. Its face was a blank, featureless void, but somehow, I knew it was looking at me, watching me. The whispers returned, louder now, and I realized they weren't coming from the air, they were coming from it. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift, pulling me closer to the figure. I turned to run, but the portal was even further away now, its light barely a flicker. The creature, or whatever it was, tilted its head, its movements unervingly slow, like it had all the time in the world. "Stay away," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. It didn't listen. Of course it didn't. Instead, it raised a long, spindly arm and pointed at me. The whispers grew deafening, drowning out my thoughts, my fear, even the sound of my own breathing. And then I understood. It wasn't just watching me. It was inviting me. The same way the fog had called me to the cliffs, the same way the archway had drawn me in. This place, this dimension, it wanted me to stay. The ground beneath me pulsed harder, the spongy surface growing stickier with every step I tried to take. The portal's light was almost gone now, a tiny pinprick against the alien sky. If I didn't move now, I'd never get back. But the whispers, they promised so much. They promised answers. They promised power. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No," I whispered, more to myself than to anything else. With every ounce of strength I had, I forced myself to run. The ground fought me, pulling at my feet, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. When I reached the portal, the light was so faint I almost couldn't see it. Without thinking, I dove through, the whispers turning into screams as the world around me collapsed. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the cliffs. The fog was gone, the moon shining brightly overhead. But the archway, it was still there, dark and silent, as if it had never been glowing at all. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I was back in my room, locking the door behind me. The dreams haven't stopped since that night, and sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear the whispers. But I've made a promise to myself. No matter how strong the pull, no matter how loud the voices get, I won't go back. At least I hope I won't.
The woods had always been her refuge, a place where Evelyn could escape the constant hum of life's demands. But today, they felt different. The air was heavier, the usual rustling of leaves oddly muted. Even the birds seemed to have vanished, leaving an eerie stillness that prickled at her skin. She had come farther than usual, following a deer trail that wound through thick clusters of trees.
That's when she saw it, a perfect circle of moss-covered stones surrounding a small pool of water. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen. The stones looked ancient, their surfaces etched with strange, spiraling patterns. The pool at the center was unnervingly still, its surface so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. Evelyn hesitated, the rational part of her screaming to turn back. But curiosity won out. She stepped closer, her boots crunching softly on the damp forest floor. As she neared the edge, the water began to ripple, though there was no breeze to disturb it. She crouched down, peering into the depths, and gasped. The rippling surface transformed into a window. On the other side, she saw a landscape bathed in twilight, with towering trees whose branches wove together like veins. Their leaves glowed faintly, casting shifting shadows across the ground. Strange, ethereal creatures flitted between the trunks, their shapes fluid and indistinct. Her breath caught in her throat. It was beautiful, otherworldly, impossible. Without thinking, she reached out. Her fingertips brushed the surface, and it felt wrong. The water was cold, but not wet. It seemed to pull at her skin, a gentle yet insistent tug. Before she could pull away, the force intensified. Her feet slipped, and she fell forward with a yelp, plunging through the pool. The sensation was disorienting, like being submerged in icy water without the suffocating pressure. When she emerged, gasping for air, she was no longer in the woods. The world around her was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft crunch of her boots on the spongy, blackened earth. The sky above was a deep, swirling gray, with no sun or stars to anchor it. The trees here were grotesque caricatures of those she'd seen through the pool, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. It echoed strangely, as if the air itself was twisting her words. She started walking, each step feeling heavier than the last. Time seemed to stretch and compress, making it impossible to tell how long she'd been moving. The shadows beneath the trees shifted unnaturally, as though they were watching her. Once or twice, she could have sworn she heard soft footsteps behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Panic bubbled up in her chest. She had to find the pool, the way back. But the landscape seemed to change with every step, the trees rearranging themselves into an endless maze. Then she saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of her vision. It was tall and thin, its body draped in something that resembled tattered smoke. Where its face should have been, there was only a void. It didn't move, but she felt its gaze, heavy and probing. Evelyn's breath quickened. "Who are you?" she managed to choke out. The figure tilted its head, an unnervingly human gesture, and then it began to move toward her, its steps slow and deliberate. She turned and ran. The forest blurred around her, the trees twisting and shifting as if trying to trap her. Her lungs burned, but she didn't stop until she stumbled into a clearing. The pool was there, its surface once again still and black. Relief flooded her as she sprinted toward it. But just as she reached the edge, the figure stepped into the clearing, its void-like face fixed on her. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She dove into the water, the icy cold enveloping her once more. For a terrifying moment, she thought she was stuck, suspended in the void between worlds. Then she burst through the surface, collapsing onto the familiar forest floor. The woods were alive with sound again. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. But something felt wrong. She looked down at her hands, trembling and pale, and froze. The shadows beneath the trees were moving, stretching toward her as though reaching for an old friend. And in the corner of her eye, just for a moment, she thought she saw the void-faced figure watching from the edge of the pool, its tattered form rippling like smoke. She backed away, her heart pounding. The woods no longer felt like a refuge. They felt like a prison, and somewhere, deep inside, she knew the portal hadn't let her go. Not completely.